समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
21st March is the day the emergency was lifted in 1977, that is 48 years ago. So this is the 48th anniversary of that major turn, an epochal turn in India's political history. And that gives me the opportunity or excuse to bring to you this episode of First Person Second Draft. I was a student during the emergency. I was not a journalist, but shortly after the emergency, I was a journalist. In fact, on the day the emergency was lifted on 21st of March 1977, I worked. It was my first job, which I only held for a few months, in a building 3 buildings away from where I record this. I'm recording this from the Express building on Delhi's Bahadur Shah Zafar Marg. 3 buildings away was Gulab Bhavan. That's where I used to work in a tiny but serious magazine called Democratic World. And I remember when the emergency was lifted, there was excitement. There were people outside the Express office because the Express was in the forefront of the fight against the emergency. There was a lot of excitement. I was 3 buildings away. However, as I said, during the emergency, I was a student, also journalism student for at least half of the emergency. That said, some things from the emergency have endured. But as often happens in us reporters' lives, I did get caught up or involved in something that had happened during the emergency, but afterwards. Because when such important events take place, that too over a period of 19 months, then they have a long tail. They have a long tail and issues go on, controversies go on. One of those controversies, for example, was brought back to life by Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he was campaigning in 2015 in August in the Bihar elections. In fact, with that one statement in that election campaign, he brought to the center stage of national debate a long forgotten figure, right? Namely Jayaprakash Narayan. Hero to many, villain to some, but a brilliantly original personality who did more to challenge and diminish the Congress party's monopoly on power than any other person before or after him. And he did so when Indira Gandhi was at the peak of her power. Now, let me also tell you what is it that the Prime Minister said in that campaign, and that is something that BJP leaders have repeated several times subsequently. And it's also an issue that M.G. Devasahayam, who was the district magistrate of Chandigarh, or deputy commissioner as the description is used in those parts, he was also a kind of superintendent of jails, head of jails. To that extent, JP was his detainee because JP was sick. He was detained in the PGI, the Postgraduate Medical Institute, Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research, but mostly known as PGI. And to that extent, he was JP's custodian. So he's also written about the experiences and of the same story in his book, Emergency and New Emergency. That also brings back the story to us. You know, we are talking about the late Jayaprakash Narayan, who led the mass upsurge against Indira Gandhi in what was seen as the first widespread anti-corruption movement or Sampurn Kranti in India's history. This was way bigger than what Anna Hazare led later. Of course, Anna Hazare was then magnified and amplified by social media, TV channels, etc., which did not exist in mid-70s. You can imagine the degree of difficulty that Jayaprakash Narayan had and the ability and the pull that he had, the mass pull he had to rouse so many people. And when his campaign led up to the imposition of the emergency, he was among those Mrs. Gandhi detained. Except, given the state of his health, as I just told you, he suffered from severe diabetes, and in 1975, treatments were not a fraction as good as they are now. Neither treatments, nor diagnosis, nor monitoring, nothing. That's the reason she decided to detain him not in a jail but in a hospital. And that hospital, the PGI in Chandigarh, is what I told you about just now. I was a mere journalism student during the emergency and not particularly politically aware. So I can't comment on any aspect of JP's life or policies or ideology with any special authority. But I can tell a story about the deterioration of his health leading to his death. And that is where I got involved as a reporter. And that is what justifies this first person second draft, because so much else has become known at that issue since then. It's also been raised by the Prime Minister. It's also something that found detailed mention in M.G. Devasayam's book. As soon as the emergency was lifted and the new Janata government fathered by JP was sworn in, a clamor began for an inquiry into what had led to the deterioration of his health, particularly his kidneys, while he was under detention. In fact, he was released from detention the same year in which he was arrested, 1975, because his health was falling. 12th November 1975, he was released in just about a couple of weeks short of 6 months after the imposition of the emergency, because nobody knew what to do with his kidneys. So he was moved to Bombay. He was looked after by Jaslok Hospital. His kidneys had by now failed entirely, and government imported a dialysis machine for him. Remember, it was still 1977 and dialysis was new to the world, unknown in India. Probably it was the first machine in India. The word dialysis was in our headlines often then. There were many conspiracy theories, and it did not help that Mrs. Gandhi had chosen to send him to Chandigarh, capital of Punjab, but more importantly, Haryana, which was then ruled by her political commissar and muscleman, Bansilal, who she then elevated as a defense minister, but he continued to run Haryana indirectly as much as he would directly. Remember the famous, or rather the infamous slogan, emergency ke teen dalal, Indra Sanjay Bansilal. It also did not help that the director of the PGI then, Dr. P.N. Chutani, see his picture, he's the one with the shaven head in that picture. He was an eminent physician, was considered particularly friendly with Bansilal, besides being Bansilal's physician as well. So the broad conspiracy theory was as follows. Mrs. Gandhi sent JP to Bansilal, who handed him over to Chutani to have him put away medically. Sure enough, in that environment, there were many believers. A one-man inquiry commission was set up, headed by a well-known Bangalore doctor called K. Nagappa Alva. It started holding hearings in camera. There was immediate consternation in the PGI faculty. Some felt victimized, others vindicated, because like all institutions, particularly government institutions, the faculty was divided, not so much in terms of national politics or ideology, but divided in terms of institutional politics, or what we might call as office politics. So some felt victimized, others felt vindicated. And as you would expect, two groups got formed overnight. This is where I sort of sleepwalked into the situation, not quite understanding the scale and significance of what was going on. I was then a very junior reporter. I had worked for no more than a few months at that point. I joined the Indian Express on 1st of August 1977. So this was maybe within a month of that in Chandigarh. And I was still on probation and not 21 years old yet. And as you can see in the accompanying pictures, the only warm jacket I owned in that weather was the college blazer, my college blazer. By this time, JP had already been released a couple of years earlier, and now Janata Party was in power. Remember, this was 1977, a few months after the lifting of the emergency, and there was a controversy about how did JP get so sick when he was detained. In a tiny city of 500,000 people then, that averaged less than 3 murders a year. How bad it is to be a crime reporter. My first assignment was to cover crime, university campus, local sports, and of course the PGI. In fact, even my first designation was reporter general and sports at a total princely salary of 600 rupees with 50 rupees thrown in as conveyance. For me, therefore, this was just Just a big story that fell in my lap and I chased it, innocent of the political nuances and complications. As usual, the two groups in the PGI fought, information leaked, and as usually happens, trade unions always become the reporters' best allies. Soon enough, therefore, while the ALBA committee or commission hearings were being held in camera, I began to get inside stories of these in-camera hearings, and these stories started finding the front page. So see this example of the Indian Express front page of 14th of May 1978. That's the story, and see the second lead on top of the page and the byline of yours truly there. It greatly upset one of my editors, who I shall not name just now. Maybe whenever or if a memoir is written, I might mention it, but in some ways I prefer not to personalize things. I'm not saying this forever, but for now, let me not personalize things and not name names. However, suffice to say, those stories, that coverage greatly upset one of my editors at the Indian Express then. Not the editor-in-chief, who was S. Mulgaonkar, but one of the illustrious group of editors who had a view on the story. As I presume, he thought the conspiracy theory was fictional and the inquiry unnecessary. He showed irritation often enough, but in the true Indian Express tradition, nobody told me to stop, and the leaks continued making page 1, usually the top half, as you saw in the sample that I just displayed to you. If I had access to more archives, I would show you more. The Janata government's health minister was the most famous maverick of Indian politics then, socialist Raj Narayan, who spoke language more colorful than Lalu Yadav's and had just defeated Indira Gandhi in the Lok Sabha elections in Raebareli. He too came to the PGI with the larger objective of looking into the deterioration of JP's death there. JP, as I mentioned to you, while he was in detention, he was in jail, but he was not sent to jail given his condition. So a ward or a floor, or maybe half a floor if I remember correctly, in the PGI special wards was declared special jail, and he was quote unquote detained there under full medical care. Now, because there were controversies as to how did his health collapse so badly while he was under detention, now Raj Narayan also came to the PGI, and I muscled my way into his car. See that picture? And then, to the consternation of officials and the institute brass, he started chatting with me and continued for a long time about this inquiry, which was supposed to be in camera. With some luck, I found some of these pictures, in fact, in my family albums, and those are the ones you are seeing on your screens as we go along. You will also note that there was a time when I also had a full mop on my head. Note his beard, belly, and the muffler in place of his trademark bandana and my college blazer. Now, if you take a closer look at how history panned out, it is more about how, after a scathing inquiry report had been submitted by Dr. Alba, the affected group of doctors succeeded in scuttling it. By this time, it would seem that I had run out of luck. This was provocation enough for that particular editor to ask for me to be fired, and he said, better do it while the idiot is still on probation. The editor said I did not understand any nuances and was too young and inexperienced to be put on a story so sensitive as this. But he had neither made provision for the express way of life or the express respect for free journalism, nor understood that Prabhas Joshi, then resident editor of Indian Express in Chandigarh, had a spine and a conscience. Also, having come from life in Sarvodaya movement as a close aide of JP, Prabhas Joshi understood the nuances very well, even if I did not. Prabhas Joshi sought the intervention of Ramnath Goenka and S. Mulgaonkar, then editor-in-chief. Both intervened to say that not only was I not to be fired, but also that I must continue following the story. I must not be taken off the story. It is a different matter that the inquiry proved nothing ultimately. There were some scathing remarks, but it proved nothing, and JP's kidneys and his death still remain an eternal mystery. The Prime Minister has brought it back to life and helped me. The Prime Minister brought it back to life and helped me recall the story of which I wrote the first draft in 2015. However, my personal view also is that there was no real conspiracy to damage JP's kidneys, and that, in fact, doctors led by renowned nephrologist Dr. K.S. Chugh had tried their best to save him, but again, medical care then was not so advanced as now. This, however, also has to be read in view of the new knowledge that we have got, because this is the second draft, as we said. And that has come in this book, Emergency and Neo Emergency by M.G. Devasahayam, an IAS officer who, as I told you, was the district magistrate of Chandigarh at that point, who was also the head of the prison system, and JP was his detainee. He's written about JP with a great deal of fondness, but about his sickness, he has said, and I quote from his book, there have been widespread suspicions and allegations about the failure of JP's kidneys in the PGI, ranging from poisoning, deliberate damage, drug-induced damage, and intentional non-diagnosis. Even JP had doubts about this. Dr. Alva was categorical in his indictment of the diagnosis and treatment of JP at the PGI. Dr. Mani, that was another doctor who investigated this. Dr. Mani's observations only add to these doubts and suspicions. On the face of it, Dr. Chutani and Dr. Aikut, who was, I think, if I remember correctly, head of pathology, Dr. Aikut's attempts at defending the undefendable do not appear to be convincing. Then Devasahayam goes on to say, I am not a medical practitioner and I cannot make a value judgment on the adequacy or inadequacy, efficacy or inefficacy of the medical diagnosis and treatment given to JP while in detention. But as JP's custodian in jail, I was responsible for his safety and well-being. And then he says, my position is this, and I quote from Devasahayam's book, there was non-diagnosis of JP's serious ailments and lack of follow-up when there was strong suspicion of kidney failure around mid-September. This is the first year of the emergency. This contention of mine is borne out by circumstances listed below, and then he lists other circumstances, including the fact that's not well known that JP had already had surgery for an enlarged prostate at Christian Medical College, Vellore earlier. This he says might have got complicated at the PGI. Then he says there was a non-reference of JP. The exact quote, a non-reference of JP, which means JP was not referred to nephrology specialists in the PGI until the time of his release. He says that Dr. K.S. Chugh, who I just mentioned, who was a renowned nephrologist, he wasn't treating JP. JP was only taken to him at the time of his release. So that is where Devasahayam brings in fresh suspicions here. And Devasahayam also says that Dr. Chutani kept on saying repeatedly that JP's ailment was psychological and not physical. And then Devasahayam says, I'm not endorsing it, not contradicting it. Devasahayam says, I know Devasahayam very well, I respect him. Sometimes we might have had argument differences, but he was a very straightforward IAS officer and committed to Indian democracy. He said, the fact of the matter is that JP's kidney failed and there appears to be a purpose behind it. In the event, it is difficult to repudiate. And then he goes on to regret that even the BJP prime ministers have failed to get to the bottom of it. He says this includes Prime Ministers Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who elevated JP to the level of Bhishma Pitamah on the bed of arrows and Christ on the cross, and Narendra Modi, who venerated JP as his icon. And Devasahayam concludes, so be it. However, the fact remains that JP indeed paid a very heavy price for defeating the emergency, which he did. Now, as for JP's legacy, the cruel truth is his followers let him down. He was a broken man when his Janta government collapsed, and Indira Gandhi returned within 3 years, people agreeing with her that they had elected a khichdi. JP was, in fact, forgotten as soon as his followers got power, to such an extent that while he was ailing in Mumbai's Jaslok hospital, the government once even announced his death in parliament, and this was the Janata government, his own government of the party he founded. They announced his death in parliament on 23rd of March 1979. JP lived on for more than 6 months after that. The Janata Party broke up on the issue of what was then called dual membership. How could leaders who had come from the earlier Janasangh had become Janata Party leaders now, how could they continue to be the members of the RSS? That was the dual membership question. How can you be the member of RSS and also of Janata Party? The party had to break up. It was basically an anti-Indira alliance, and once it got power, all other contradictions came in. This, however, became the main cause, dual membership. It was the same old secular versus communal, left versus right divide. JP was rooted in the former, but his socialist supporters dumped him. They became powerful in their own right, many ending up as chief ministers or in the central cabinet. Many, in fact, in the course of time becoming Congress party's allies. And that is what Prime Minister Modi was referring to while invoking JP's health and the damage to his health in that 2015 campaign. Because Nitish, Lalu Yadav, they were both in jail as young leaders, and they were in a way JPites and who had now joined hands at various points of time with the Congress party. It is therefore such an irony now that his memory and legacy are being resurrected by the BJP RSS. It is therefore such an irony, given the fact that he was a man from the socialist/secular stream, that his memory and legacy are repeatedly resurrected by the BJP and RSS again and again, and not so much by his fellow socialists. How significant or respected a figure he is in Bihar's political memory, where his name keeps coming up in election campaigns, is tough to say. As with much else that was great in our political history, his name has also been trivialized. I caught this motorbike, see this picture, with no number plate. Its anarchist owner claiming to be a JP Sanani. Please see that number plate. JP Sanani means JP's warrior. And this was not far from his native village, Sitabdiara, at Rajnath Singh's rally during the 2014 Lok Sabha election campaign. And I told you, in some case, his memory has been trivialized. Sometimes it's brought up during election campaigns. It also becomes part of the folklore. So if you watched Gangs of Wasipur, which was also a cult film, in Gangs of Wasipur, there is a song, तार बिजली से पतले हमारे पिया, अरे सासू बता तूने ये क्या किया. See that also it tells you the lyricist's political awareness, because there is a line in that song, if you hear it correctly, and that line is, अरे छपरा के बाबूजी ये क्या किया, लोक नायक जलाए ये कैसा दिया. So this is a lament on the state of Bihar at that point. Lok Nayak is the reference to Jayaprakash Narayan. That is how he was hailed, and Chhapra was his hometown. So the line is, "Are Chhapra ke babuji ye kya kiya? Lok Nayak jalaye ye kaisa diya?" That in spite of whatever you do by way of a total revolution, Bihar is in such a bad way. That said, before I let you go, please see the facsimile of this front page. Now, this is the front page that I used just a while earlier to show you my story, my byline story. On the top half of the page, second lead in the paper on investigation into JP's health. The headline, simple headline, fresh probe into JP's treatment. See the last two columns. But see the other stories on this page. This is 14th of May, 1978. This is just about a year after the Janata government had come in. But see the state of national politics and the state of the Janata party and its governments. The lead story, this is the Chandigarh edition, the lead story, cabinet post for two rebels, High Command directive to Devilal, which means Devilal's Janata party government in Haryana is already having a crisis. Then you see a little bit below that, Yadav turns aggressive. That's a young MLA then, Mulayam Singh Yadav, still in the glory of his emergency time detention. He's giving trouble to his own Janata party government there. If you go lower down on the same page, Janata wooing CPM and AIA-DMK, because Janata party at the center is now worried that a breakaway group may take some MPs away and they may be left in a minority. So they are reaching out to CPM and AIA-DMK at that point. And then just above that, Shanta Kumar kept in the dark. That is because of a crisis that's broken out with the Janata government in Himachal Pradesh. I suspect that was to do with the incident that happened with the young woman minister Shama Sharma, not far from what is called as Scandal Point in the capital city of Shimla. So you can see that within a year of coming into being, Janata Party was in a crisis, and this front page, if anything, was just a mirror of those times. That's the reason I thought this was a good day for us to visit the story and also the politics of that era, and see so many of the same phenomena and same characters and same issues are still around. And we've been talking of very serious life and death issues, and who can take a more serious look at the state of national politics than a good cartoonist? In this case, a great cartoonist, and Abu Abraham. So see that cartoon at the bottom of the page. Abu Abraham's pocket cartoon, as the small cartoons of page 1 are called. What does the cartoon say? It says in 1978, it says India can put man in space. That's a claim somebody might have made in the Janata government. And then it goes on to say, as Nanaji might say, those over 60 should go first. So this is when Nanaji Deshmukh, the patriarch of the RSS and BJP, had said that politicians should take retirement and those who attain the age of 60 should retire. That was also an indication to many in the Janata Party right now who were caught in this warfare whereby their own government was falling apart. And this statement by Nanaji was brought back to me much later in a Vakta talk that I recorded with K.S. Sudarshan when he was Sarsang Chalak or head of the RSS. And he said that even Nanaji Deshmukh had set a personal example by retiring after the age of 60, and he had also given advice to all other politicians to retire after the age of 60. That in the case of Sudarshanji was clearly a hint to Vajpayee and Advani.